Producing from the Margins, Best Practices for Inclusive Programming. What we want to talk about really is how the American theater is doing, in a way, with thinking about what we term in the theater community EDI, which is equity, diversity, and inclusion. So there is a movement across the country, and it's been going on for quite some time, that is sort of an iteration of what in the 90s was kind of, we thought of as multiculturalism. And that was the terminology that was used. And that has evolved as theaters have been thinking more about the way their constituent, the kind of work they're doing, and their constituents, their audiences. Part of it is actually motivated by the fact that audiences are shrinking because certain members of our communities are literally not invited into the theater, both on the stage because they're not reflected on the stage and in audiences. So that was partially motivated by that, and then of course motivated by primarily artists that want their voices to be heard and deserve that, to take leadership in the American theater. So there's been a really strong current and push towards equity, diversity, and inclusion in the theater community. And we find ourselves now at a bit of a crossroads in terms of what that really means in a day-to-day working, practical working process. What that means for folks who feel that they have been on the margins of our communities, of our theater community, are in somewhat greater numbers sometimes brought into the process, but then what happens? And so we wanted to have a conversation about that, and we've invited some amazing guests, all of whom are Playwrights Foundation family and amazing theater artists who are working all over the country, both in our community and in the larger national community. So I'm gonna turn to each one of these individuals. I would like you to introduce yourselves and who you are, what you do, what you care about in the moment, and then we'll have a conversation about this topic, and then we'll turn it over to you. You can ask some questions for us.
So I'm Vidhu Singh, and I started out being a recovering academic. I grew up in India. I was born and raised in India, and I arrived in UC Santa Barbara, and I got a master's in dramatic art and Western theater. The program at the time was exclusively Western, usually European and American, Anglo-American theater. And then decided to go to the University of Hawaii, which was the opposite. I had a couple of choices, and UH at Manoa had this big Asian theater program, which is still a great program. And so I arrived in Hawaii, and my professors were in flip-flops. Everyone had different accents, and essentially I got to study both Western theater, but also Chinese theater, Japanese theater, Southeast Asian theater, and South Asian theater.
You went to India and you got turned on to
contemporary experimental regional theater, which was very exciting.
Okay.
And so I got to study theater in India as an adult, having left and then gone back. And there was a very exciting movement at the time, regionally, different languages, and incredible stuff happening. And they knew everything happening in the West, and they were sort of digging into their own traditions regionally as well, and having these great conversations. And so I was really humbled, essentially, and excited to be part of this. After the PhD, I just decided I'd also taught theater, taught multicultural theater. I decided to become a practitioner, became a director, and by default started directing South Asian and Indian plays, Pakistani plays, even plays set in Bangladesh. Just because no one else was doing it, and I wanted to tell these stories, and I didn't know any better, so I started producing my own work. And then I was essentially forced into being a dramaturg because often these plays run other languages. I didn't know that I was a dramaturg at the time, but they were in other languages, or the plays really needed to be shaped, kind of trimmed a little bit, etc. And so I was doing that. And then, so I've been directing, and then discovering that what I like about dramaturgy is that it brings back some of my kind of analytical, academic, literary interest and joins that with the theater. Great. And I thought it would be easier than directing, but it's not.
Yeah. Excellent. Nothing's easy, right?
Claudia, Alick.
Speaking of nothing being easy, would you like me just in a few minutes to sum up my career? I can do this. And forgive me, I'm in the midst of having a bit of an allergy attack, so you're going to see me dabbing my eye. It's actually not because I'm emotionally caught up in our conversation, although I'm excited about the conversation. So I am a theater practitioner, and I actually feel like a lot of these siloed labels we give to ourselves about theater roles you're allowed to hold, that's actually part of the colonization of cultural production. So we're kind of enculturated into that early in our careers. Oh, if you would like to be a part of the culture, the systems of cultural production, you're allowed to embody. You're not allowed to author, you're not allowed to direct, you're not allowed to decide how your stories will be told, you're just allowed to be in a story. You're supposed to feel very grateful for it. So in my early career, I felt so grateful and happy to be allowed to be on stage and to get the skill sets necessary to embody characters on stage. Then in my undergraduate career, through a series of unlikely events, I actually ended up running a university program at the George Washington University, where I was supposed to be the work study assistant for the person who ran the whole program, but she had a health issue. They were going to shut it down, and I said, I'll run the entire thing for the $7.50 an hour you wanted to pay me. And they blinked and were like, okay. And I don't think they understood that they were saying yes to someone who could do that. I think they thought that I would run it for a week and be like, this is too hard and complicated. And in fact, I was like, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. It was also the worst thing that happened to me because it taught me at like age 21, oh right, you can definitely do all these things as long as you have access to the resources. So I graduated and suddenly had no small theater that I just had access to and no people to work for me for free. And then I learned, oh right, there are other parts of the producing ecology that you're going to have to get your hands on. So I've had several theater companies in my career. I've worked as a New York neo-futurist. I'm currently co-president of the board of the Network of Ensemble Theaters. I was the community producer at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival for a decade, and that position allowed me to work as in dramaturgical positions as well as assistant directing on some of our main stage plays, be involved in the ecology of, how do large regional theaters decide, how do they choose what they're going to put on their main stage? How does that happen? I did a lot of presenting, so presenting just hundreds and hundreds of different groups, as well as devising community collaborative performances, which often meant I was directing and devising work that held on, that embodied and held on to a lot of other people's stories. And I think the last piece of stuff I do in the world that might be interesting for this conversation would be I produce national collaborative projects that are about subjects of social justice. So when we were doing the Every 28 Hours plays, that also brought us into encounter in some complicated ways, stories that were about African American experience, which I felt a lot of ownership over, and yet those were stories that were not mine. So it was that complicated, negotiating that complicated territory. So that's Claudia, Alick in a very fast nutshell, and I'm currently the founder and president of a transmedia social justice company called Calling Up Justice.
Thank you.
You were so efficient.
Thank you.
Nakissa, Etemad.
Hi, I am a dramaturg. I've been a dramaturg for 25 years. I'm also a director, a producer, and a French translator. I'm a resident artist with Golden Thread, the first Middle Eastern theater company in the country, and it's just right upstairs and uses this stage. So
It's their home stage.
it's our home stage. And I am the regional vice president of Metro Bay Area for LMDA. Has anyone heard of the LMDA? Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. And my beginning was fast and furious, and everything kind of just fell into place for me. When I was an undergrad, I was undeclared. I went to Paris, and I realized I did all these upper division courses in French, and semiology, psychoanalysis, psychology in theater, sound in theater, and did classes at the Sancier de Bonton, Université de Paris 3. And then I realized, oh, people in Paris are artists and they make a living that way, and it's okay! So I came back, revved up, okay, I think I can figure it out. I auditioned for an acting class that was too full. I had always been an actor and singer as a little kid and in high school. I was the funny actress in high school plays and musicals. And Todd Salovey, who's still the Associate Artistic Director of San Diego Rep, was the teacher, and the class was too full. He did 5-minute interviews with us. He learned what I did in Paris, what I studied. He said, do you know what a dramaturg is? I said, no. He said, you'd be a good one. Come work for me. So he told me I was a dramaturg, and he was right. My dad's a literal rocket scientist. My mom's a painter. So I have both sides of the brain. Creativity, love working with people, love helping people, and nurture, support, and craft. And I also love analyzing and deconstructing and structure and numbers and all these things. So thus was born a dramaturg. As Terrence likes to say, I was born to be a dramaturg. So San Diego Rep was my first artistic home. They created a position for me when I got out of school. While I was professionally dramaturging for them, I did an MFA in dramaturgy at UC San Diego. And we did a lot of African American work and Latino work. That was the name of it in those days. It actually started as Hispanic theater in those days, in the 90s. So in my first 7 years of being a dramaturg, I did 6 world premieres there, and most of them were Black or Latinx plays. And to this day, I work a lot with Marcus Gardley, and it's only in the last 5 years or so, I'm working on Iranian and Middle Eastern plays because they did not exist in the 90s.
And your family.
So I'm Iranian American. Did I not say that?
No.
Hi, I'm this white chick like loving Middle Eastern theater. No. My parents are Iranian American, Iranian-born people. My dad was called Mr. Apollo in Iran. He was the first Iranian on the American space program. So we're really first generation American in this country. I am.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is Duca Knezevic. Duca.
I got my American citizenship 2 years ago, so I'm kind of fresh. I am coming from a country where theater is a great agent for change. And the government gives lots of money for theater development, theater artists, theater institutions, well aware that we are very much questioning each step they take every day. So that's the background that I studied theater in. I dealt with theater. I lived through a civil war doing theater, which was at the time the second party in a one-party system of former Yugoslavia. At the same time, the only real opposition to the government throughout the 80s. You've probably known about Václav Havel, who was the first president of the new, at the time, Czechoslovakia, which is now 2 different countries. But you probably don't know about Arpad Genc, who is another playwright who was the president of Hungary at the same time when the changes were happening. So theater people were on the forefront of the changes that were happening in the society. And the government was paying for it. I studied dramaturgy because our system is completely different. There is no playwriting. I was a playwright at the time. And dramaturgy is conceived as a program that gives opportunities to all people who love playwriting, but some are more practically, some are more theoretically inclined, because not everybody has a talent to be a playwright. So, although I have 10 or 11 plays produced in my name, and they're still being produced in different countries of former Yugoslavia, I prefer to see myself as a dramaturg because I wanted to be a dramaturg because I need that not only our theater audience, but the populace in general needs additional education. And I always wanted to be the one who was going to help raise the awareness of what was happening. So I came to the country a couple of years after August Wilson's The Ground on Which I Stand. And being from a communist country, we were looking at it from out there, we are looking out here, and saying, yeah, racism is well alive and kicking in the US. So that was the view of somebody who's coming from a totally different system, totally different approach. And I had the luxury to come here and choose something else as my first occupation because I didn't come for theater to this country, I came for love. As another idealistic notion in my life, you know. Here comes theater and then here comes love. So I came to the US not to change the government by doing theater.
But you're leaving it.
Which I did in my previous country. So I have a day job that pays the mortgage, and then I do theater as a freelancer and keep doing the same things that I was doing back in former Yugoslavia. So that's a little info about me.
And just to emphasize the word former, because one of the things that I've known Duca almost since the beginning of my time at Playwrights Foundation, and we actually provided you with the HB1 visa to stay here, and when the one thing that always really impacted me, and I think would be an interesting part of this conversation, is that not only was there a civil war, but you also lost your home, you lost your country, you lost your nationality, as it were, your identity.
Yeah, until I got my U.S. citizenship, I was for 9 years, I didn't have citizenship of anything. And I traveled on a refugee passport, which is a whole other issue. But, you know, it's a part of, you know, being the other. So yes. I've lived with it my whole life, so this was nothing new in my life.
Great. So, thank you, those of you who have come in a little bit late. What we're talking about is producing from the margins, best practices for inclusive programming. And so what I want to talk about, I don't know how, if you've heard some of the latest atrocities that have occurred in the American theater, but very recently, Antoinette and Wandu's play, Passing Over, was canceled at the Echo Theater in Los Angeles. This is after quite a number of very successful runs in New York and various other places. And the reason that it was canceled was that the Echo Theater's longtime artistic director programmed this play and hired an African-American director for an all-African-American cast and an African writer who allegedly he did not trust, and his actions showed, at least her and others, that he did not trust her. And the breach of that relationship between an artistic director and the director of the production spiraled to the point where Antoinette pulled the rights for the show and they were forced to cancel it. And so this was, this was, the outcome of a long line of missed opportunities to connect. And so that was one thing. And there have been quite a number of other issues that have cropped up between artists from communities that are often not represented or invited to participate in the American theater, and the leadership, the white, nearly all white leadership of those institutions. So I wanted to open up a conversation and a dialogue about, I think I'd like to start with, if you have a story you'd like to, what was an instance in your own life and experience where your perspective wasn't respected, or you saw others that you were working with and collaborating with having to struggle with issues around othering, with issues around disrespect, whether it was meant or not meant, and how that felt.
I love your question. I want to answer a question you didn't ask, though.
Okay.
That's disrespecting the formula for our conversation, though, so you stop me if I'm taking us off on a different track. But the situation that happened with Dina, who's just a brilliant director, it really reminded me, so I've been doing this
at the Echo Theater?
Yes. Dina was the director of that production.
Okay, great.
Really great director.
Let's talk about
and it actually reminded me of something that I've been looking at for the past 2 years. So I've been traveling the country doing this project called #Walkabout, where I'm just looking at the intersections of cultural production and justice, and why sometimes we'll have outcomes of justice and sometimes we won't. And trying to figure out, well, what happens when a theater decides we are going to do this script that is definitely going to be story and narrative that brings us into encounter with themes of justice, and we're going to be forced to grapple with them, and our audience is going to experience them, and won't this be great for the world? And then trying to figure out why is the experience that actually ends up happening not one of justice? What happens? So looking at the larger structures, I go, well, it's a gigantic ensemble collaboration, the collaboration of creating a cultural production. So who are the main collaborators on your board? Who are those folks who get to decide who's doing the curatorial decision making of who are the people who will be artistic directors in charge of deciding how resources will be distributed and who's in charge of deciding what stories are? That's the first step, and generally I lean back and I look and I go, wow, generally those bodies are homogenous and replicated all over the United States. They tend to be almost exclusively white men, which seems like a problem when you're trying to do culturally specific productions, and your job is to empower the storytellers to do the best possible job that they need to do. And the question is telling that story authentically, giving that power, sharing that power authentically with all of those folks, is that somehow counter to what the institutions are built to do? Is that why there's a conflict? That's the deep, gigantic question I'm grappling with and meditating on this week and today. It's not the question you asked that was a personal story specific to me, but it's the thing I'm meditating on, which is a little larger.
Yeah, that is your story. Well, maybe you each could comment on that particular instance, because it's a really interesting and very difficult, kind of thorny situation. How do we begin to diversify the stories that are told, the bodies who are on stage, and those who control the resources? And
well, I'm in a fortunate situation because Golden Thread is founded by an Iranian-Armenian woman to do plays by and from the Middle East. And so, and it's about 22, 23 years old now, started in '96, so I guess older than that. And so she, over time, has created a board, an audience, an acting pool, a design pool that are not all Middle Eastern, but there are many. So we're lucky. We've got.
Although you did say that in the last 5 years you've started working on plays that from Middle Eastern writers and specifically Iranian playwrights, because before you didn't, there weren't any. So
And that's me, yeah.
Maybe
that's
you could talk a little bit about that experience
Well,
prior to working at Golden Thread.
So Golden Thread, I didn't know they existed for many years because I started in San Diego and I graduated at the time Torange started Golden Thread up in San Francisco. I was in San Diego. Then I ended up moving to Philadelphia, then to London. So I just didn't know about them.
Yeah, right.
But all the time, I was 15 years a dramaturg and literary manager at 3 companies. We didn't get submissions of Middle Eastern plays. We didn't have discussions about where are those Middle Eastern plays? We should add them to our season. They just weren't in the pool. They weren't being written, or they weren't. Also, I should say that in Iranian culture specifically, kids are not raised to become artists. They're raised, there are many poets. There's a long tradition of miniature painting in Iran, and Sufi, Rumi is Iranian, and Hafez, all these famous poets. But your parents want you to be doctors and lawyers and successful and highly educated. And so my dad agreed for me to be an artist because I wanted to get a Ph.D. at the time. He said, yes, get the highest education you can and then it's okay. If you know what you want to be, if you know you want to be this dramaturg, and great, you have an MFA. I support you. So that's part of the reason there aren't many Middle Eastern writers, because it's not sort of coveted in the culture to go and be a theater artist necessarily. So that was my personal experience. I actually got a lot of my current contacts and work through Amy and Jane Wenger at the Playwrights Foundation. They introduced me to Marcus Gardley. They introduced me to Maricela Trevino-Horta, who I worked with, both of them, for 10 years, roughly 8 to 10 years on many things. And so, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
But
yeah, well, you were talking about, well, I had asked you about the rise of Middle Eastern writers, but writers specifically from Iran or Iranian American.
That's right, yeah.
Or possibly other Middle Eastern and Muslim countries.
And honestly, the play started bouncing out of into American scene because of 9/11. The artists had a reason to poke the theater companies and the boards and the audiences and the artistic directors to say, okay, you all think we're awful terrorists, we're also these other things. So they had a voice, they had something to say. And then we started having Heather Raffo. And all these Middle Eastern plays were done at the Wilma after I left. I was in London with that man, with my husband. So that's just, sorry. That's my perspective of Middle Eastern theater trajectory.
Can I jump in and just say, with the South Asian theater in this country, it didn't really take off till as late as 2006. Definitely lots of efforts, but it didn't really become a movement till pretty late. I definitely consider myself kind of an old-timer and kind of pioneer of sorts, just being part of that collective sporadic effort. And so now there's some incredible South Asian playwrights in the country, including Madhuri Sekar, whose play House of Joy I'm now the dramaturg for, which is just a really badass play, and I'm very excited about it. So, of course, other folks who crossed over, into the mainstream. And
Duca.
Deepika Guha, the Shishir Group in Los Angeles, is an amazing artist. Wears many hats, has been a great leader in the community, and all these folks. Of course, Rajiv Joseph. I remember being all Tiger in the Baghdad Zoo. I saw the first reading.
And Playwrights Foundation.
Playwrights Foundation. And it was such a good play. I just knew. You just heard it, and you knew it was going to go places, right?
Right.
And
but I guess I'm interested in understanding how these artists were treated within the context of, as they rose to prominence, how they were treated by the theater companies, how what agency these playwrights really had in the marketing of the materials, and are we and looking at how does it feel to be a South Asian playwright who has a completely white audience watching the work?
I can certainly say for myself as a director that I just wanted to do things and I did them. And I didn't go through, the channels of the nonprofit theater per se, because I created a small company, but I didn't really follow the whole nonprofit route, and I would have friends who were investors and just do these shows and pull in a lot of people. So just because I cared about the story, essentially, and I'm also, sort of I would say, sort of a cultural activist, if there was an issue that I was passionate about. I just felt it was important, so I also did some of the gun control plays in every 28 hours plays, and that's how I met Claudia. And so I did plays around after Orlando, when the shootings happened, etc. So, and I like actually, Claudia, what you said is that we wear many hats, and we have the freedom. Like I have the freedom to be and do anything I want in the theater and outside the theater, right? Because I feel even.
So by taking agency and claiming space, it creates a kind of, sounds like it creates a powerful position for you as an artist that you aren't asking someone to give you.
Yeah, I can produce shows, I can pack houses, and I've done that historically. And what I like to do is create a buzz, have a really fun, energetic exchange that happens. I don't care if it's not perfect. So I feel like exchange and energy and interaction with the audience and conversation, that's what matters to me. So, and with a lot of these South Asian shows or, they've been like community events, a lot of them, But, a lot of folks come and people are excited about them. And then someone like me, then I found either investors or I found community partners or organizations or co-presenters like Bravo. So I can actually do work that I care about. It's not easy to do.
No, it isn't.
It isn't easy, but I'm with other folks. I think I think of Madhuri's play and how absolutely brilliant she is on the plays, and and.
I'll tell you what she's talking about in just a moment.
Yeah. But I'll let you go ahead.
Yes, do so.
I have two stories. One is to answer Amy's question, the other one is to answer Claudia's question. Amy's question, how I felt. Although my first job in the US on first H-1B visa was with former Theatre Rhinoceros, LGBT theater, that at the time that I got to be Associate Artistic Director was an equity house, was finally operated not in red. It had 5 employees, I was 6th one, on a payroll, which is unheard of for that kind of a establishment. And you would think that, as a lesbian woman in a LGBT theater, I wouldn't feel like, there's something wrong with me. But unfortunately, that was often the case. Although as we all know, there is no lesbian angels in America yet. And there is no good lesbian play that we can all swear by. Name lesbian playwrights. You can make it to 5, and then what do you say after that? So the outgoing artistic director was a white dude, the incoming artistic director was a white dude, our managing director was a straight white dude. So that's a climate in which I was trying to bring in lesbian artists. And it was pulling teeth every day. It was, truth to be told, there are no lesbians in our audience, there are no lesbian donors, there is no lesbian in the board. And why would they be there if there is nothing for them to see apart from naked boys singing? So for 3 years I was trying to bring the lesbians in all on no budget. I was trying to do the readings of lesbian plays. At that time, that was, we are talking 2000 to 2004, 2001, 2004. There were not so many readings going around in every single theater because they were not funded at that time by anybody. So the big theaters didn't figure out that you can get the money just by reading a play and not ever producing it. So I was bringing these women that I've never met, you know, I was having an open call for lesbian plays throughout the season. I contacted every lesbian artist in the city and said, hey, could you come by and can you send me whatever? All that I could do was, the guys would kind of say, we'll just put Marga Gomez's New Year show and that's it. And that would satisfy our lesbian programming. And some of those artists that I was gathering at the time are now doing work in other theaters, not at the Rhino though. And the whole story of that theater is totally different, but I was trying really hard to make something. There was a couple of plays that eventually got produced after I got out of there, and a couple of theater directors who actually started directing on the San Francisco stages, because before that they were never given a chance. So I've done something little, but you know, I don't see it's much, especially because Rhino folded after that. My second story, to answer Claudia's question, and one of the reasons why I became dramaturg is that the white dude stronghold is so everywhere, so prevalent, so systemic, that trying to riot against it in the theater, we have to do it in every other institution, every day, every minute of it. Look at what our theater education is. When my second H-1B ran out, you cannot be on H-1B anymore, somebody has to apply for your green card. And these little theaters or whatever, they don't earn the Silicon Valley money to be able to promise that kind of salary for somebody to obtain a green card. And somebody who was very, good intended told me, college circuit, that's the place for you. You can get in as a chair right away. So just apply for everything. All of a sudden, I became extremely popular with community colleges in Southern California, like in Orange County and these kind of richer counties. And I thought, wow, I'm really going to make it. Because I would always make it in the final two candidates. So I was the minority candidate. And then there was a white dude who was teaching there for the last 20 years, who was the second candidate. 5 times I went to those interviews thinking, they really want me, I can do this job. 5 times the dude got the job. So finally, one of the colleagues who works there, and those are the colleges that are half bought by Disney. All they do, they produce Disney musicals. And they think they teach theater. You go through the faculty directory, there is not one person of color in it. So you know immediately who you are dealing with, but that's what it is. So that's my answer. There is no way that we can fight this just in theater by producing just this particular playwright or giving chance to this particular director. We have to do it everywhere. We have to do it at our workplace. We have to do it in school where our kids are enrolled. It's just, it's because the problem is so systemic. The solutions have to be systemic. And, it's not an easy work, but if we don't do it, who will?
Yes, yes, yes. And just riffing off of your response and also the way the conversation's framed, I've also been thinking about what do we mean by margins and what do we mean by centered? Who's being marginalized, who's doing the marginalization, who's being centered, where is the center? Because I know for me, it was being surrounded by cultural productions where I was always othered, being asked as a person entering into the arts field, please learn how to perform whiteness. you're going to spend a bunch of money to take an entire class to do every single white person accent in the world, and you will leave without being able to do a credible Caribbean accent. Now, luckily, my family's from Grenada, so I kind of had that, but still, George Washington University, you owe me some money. I'm just saying. But I'm interested, though, in the core conceit of the question is, what are the best producing practices we can do when we are hoping to produce the other? And and what I've heard in this conversation is, well, the best thing is to have culturally specific institutions with culturally specific leadership so that they aren't producing the other, they're producing themselves. But then I ask myself, when am I producing the other? And how do I survive? How do I do well if I do not have hierarchical authority inside one of those institutions?
And to follow on that is the American theater is not primarily, does not primarily consist of theaters that are specific cultural institutions.
That's right.
Serving specific,
I'm going to say yes/no to that.
okay.
Yes, the American theater is composed of primarily white-dominated institutions. If we think of the American theater as the regional theater scene. But if we think of American theater as all of the institutions that are often undercapitalized, not recognized, not big enough to be able to even afford to go to a theater communications group conference, then I would argue actually that we exist, we're around, we're doing it, but we're not actually included in that thing that we call
That's a really good point. So if you are a producer, and there are lots of producers in the room and artists, if you're an artist or if you're a producer, this is a question for you guys in the room, whether you are at a large institution that we call the American Theater, or whether you're at a place like Playwrights Foundation, or other, really grassroots, small, mighty, theaters where people are oftentimes, working for nothing, but still come to these places with a mindset that may or may not be welcoming or be respectful or have the capacity to encompass what needs to be done. What tips and suggestions you have for best practices in working with an artist who's writing, or a group of artists who are writing about an experience that you don't necessarily share, or experiences that you have not encountered that might trigger you or might just not be in your, and then you make decisions for that company. What advice do you have? What tips do you have?
I'll say something funny.
Okay, good.
Hire dramaturgs.
I agree.
Because dramaturgs are trained to find the authentic, the real, the true, and we're really good detectives. We do all the research we have to do. If we are the other to the playwright, and we also, that even Golden Thread does that. When we're doing a specific country that we're not representing, we try to find a person that's from the country to be part of the collaborative team. And we're in America, it's a melting pot. And the way if we want to have equity, diversity, inclusion, we have to mix. We can't also just keep to ourselves either. That doesn't help. We want white people in the audience, and brown people, and Asian people, and all kinds of people. And that's how we're all, one of the messages that Torange and Silk Road Rising and someone else, it might have been North Theater, did a letter to the American Theater asking all the artistic directors in the country to please look at Middle Eastern plays and try to consider them also in your programming when you curate your seasons. And that the advice is just open your mind and involve many people, and conversation is so important. Cross-communication is so important.
There's also the company that Evren started with a group of directors. Can you talk to that?
I don't know the name.
Maya Directors.
Yeah, actually the director of House of Joy, Megan Sandberg-Zakian, she's part of Maya as well.
So they formed a collective group of artists. Maya stands for Middle Eastern,
North African.
North African.
The MENA.
Oh, MENA.
Yeah.
And basically they formed a consulting group, essentially, and you can hire them and pay them to consult with you if you are say a largely white theater or not a white theater but not necessarily of Middle Eastern descent, to come in and to consult with you on casting, on specific cultural threads within the play and what the history behind that, to find a dramaturg who's appropriate for the piece, and to talk a little bit about the directorial process, the costuming, that kind of stuff. So it's a consulting agency, and basically by forming this group of directors and dramaturgs, they're also making a statement about what is actually appropriate and needed when encountering a play from the Middle Eastern canon. They're literally, just by doing that, they're saying this is a best practice right here. We're here and we want to talk to you.
I really actually love what Golden Thread is doing and what even the Maya directors are doing. I mean, these are amazing initiatives, and I think that Turaj and Golden Thread have put Middle Eastern theater on the American map. I think some of the best playwriting right now is coming out from companies like that, and I 100% second you, like it's the dramaturg. And also not just frankly, sometimes a random person from the community to explain things to you.
So you were talking about this Orientalist play that bothered
you. Okay, so you have an awful play. You have a big company spending a lot of money on it, and they want someone to help the director out, who happens to be a young white guy from New York.
Just happens to be.
Yeah. You know, there's the sort of the theater person like me who's been doing it forever, and then I'm supposed to be his assistant.
Right.
So I listen to the story, I read the play, I meet the playwright, and I just wanted to run a million miles away. But to refuse that company was a big deal. So I actually sat in and I wrote a whole critical piece about the play, and I said, listen, please include this. There are problems with this storytelling, and you know, and here's my perspective if you want it. If you really want the feedback, I'll give it to you. But I did listen in, and I did actually write like a dramaturg, wrote about the whole play and said, well, can you include this, and this is problematic, etc., etc. And I went to see the show. It was a beautiful show. I enjoyed it. It had improved. I had some regrets. But then I was like, no, I couldn't do it. It was too demeaning. So there's my story.
I also want to say that there are sometimes institutions that will act as if putting one person from the culturally specific group that they're working on in an assistant position is prophylactic to any kind of a critique that they'll receive. And that's usually because they're in the middle of the process when they realize, oh shoot, these are deep waters, and we're possibly about to break through the ice and drown ourselves. And so then they hire someone, and then
there's always another willing community member.
Exactly.
Theater will help out.
Exactly, and yeah, generally they aren't giving that person any kind of institutional or hierarchical authority. They're asking you to let them know where are our mistakes, where are our challenges, so they can solve them, but then they're mad at you if you bring them up and go, well, you have fundamental flaws here. They're going to cost you a bunch of money. So that's complicated. And you gave a great gift to that institution, a huge gift. I know if I was the artistic director, I'd be hiring you again, because I would know that you would give me labor for free. You would help me out. Not it might damage your career.
That person actually said, you know, said something to the effect like, no one says no to us. You know, so
White dude stronghold.
So that's an interesting position to be put into, you know, being the one to authenticate this piece that actually you couldn't authenticate.
I couldn't stand
And-
behind it. I was
Yeah.
embarrassed. I was deeply embarrassed and offended by the thing. And I was horrified. Let me not tell you the story.
No, it's fine, it's fine, because we're gonna talk about House of Joy in a moment, but I'd like to hear from you, Claudia, about this, about the same topic, really, just a little bit more, because you're working all over the country and you've seen many institutions, it sounds like.
Indeed. I was just vibing on the conversation. What was the initial question you had asked?
I don't remember. Because we have veered into.
I know, what do we do in situations where
Right.
in the right to do the strongholds, if
Yeah.
we happen to work in that?
Right.
How do we bring about
Right.
the change?
The best
Yes.
practices.
Well,
What are a
I
few?
think that I've already said, or maybe I haven't. So I believe that the best way to make sure you've got best practices is to give people power and resources to make the best things happen. And that's a complicated thing to manifest. So ultimately, I actually think we're always designing ourselves for outcomes of injustice if we're not empowering the cultural producers inside of the cultural institutions. Break the wheel. That's what I think we need to do.
I think that's a really interesting, perspective, and I think that I also want to kind of point to that it's not just the artistic side either, because there's also the marketing side of the equation and how the work is represented, and not allowing or seeking any input from the artist that you're working with to speak on the work in a way that respects it, and can lead to some pretty.
And let me lift up a positive story, since
Yeah.
we talked we spilled a bunch of tea today. So I would say that an example of some strong and healthy collaboration has been with Dominique Morisseau and her work. And I will say that I'm crediting Dominique. I'm also crediting the institutions he's collaborating with, because they did not resist or stop her from doing her best work. But as a playwright, she is a producer playwright. She comes and she's like, y'all, this is how you're not gonna mess it up. This is how you're going to invite the audience for this show, and this is how you're going to make sure the audience actually has a good time and isn't turned off by some of your institutional communication practices. And that requires having an empowered playwright, a playwright that has experience, but also a playwright who feels like they can say this is what will be needed. I would also say that I think Lauren Yee does some really good work in that arena as well.
agree.
And so a good thing for theaters to do and producers to do is to empower your playwright to have opinions about marketing, communications, as well as the things literally happening on the stage.
And I will add to that the word trust, because I think that in the case of the Echo Theater, we are seeing a white artistic director who lacks trust and communicates that lack of trust. And that echoes back down all the way through. And I think that it can be, destructive, like literally destructive to a particular artist's work. And so I think that engendering trust as an artistic director, noticing if you're white, like I am, noticing where you do lack trust. Where is it that you are trying to control the artistic process that a team of people are involved with, and not listening to what that team is trying to accomplish, and then helping with that, because that is your job, and lifting that up, that vision. So in the case of the Echo Theater, it was a vision that was not being trusted and not being allowed. So that there, for me, that's an internal work that needs to be done. If this is what you're doing, and always, for me, checking yourself. Check yourself. What are you thinking right now? Is that, we come to this work with preconceived ideas that we may or may not be aware of. So you have to go back and say, I'm a person who has privilege in this situation. Not only am I the artistic director and running the budget, I also, am hiring people and they want to work for me again. So they probably will do what I ask them to do. That's a shit ton of power. And so if you are that person in this room, checking yourself is the most important thing you can do, in my opinion.
And I really also, Nakissa, you were talking about dramaturgs and how important dramaturgs are in this process. I also think community outreach specialists.
I was just going to say that.
I just love, projects where their community outreach is done for these shows.
Can you talk a little bit more?
I did a tour of 4 world premieres of Marcus Gardley's The Road Weeps, The Well Runs Dry, and it had an entire community engagement component attached to it. We had 4 directors for versions of the plays, but Marcus and I went to every one across the country. And then it was a Black Seminole play about the founding of the first incorporated all-Black town in America. And so we engaged the Native American population of each city and went to all the high schools, and we had community partners in every city. And so we incorporated the world they live in and the culture that exists in that town and thread it into the content of the play. And we ended up getting a lot of new audience members for the theater companies. We found people that totally related to the story of the play, and people crying about, I'm Seminole and I didn't realize, and this is my story too. And so community engagement can be part of the artistic team. Dramaturgs are good at that too, but it's also, that's a way to put the story out in the community.
So did you come in like months ahead of time or during the process of the
both
process
during
of production?
the rehearsal process.
Probably
So
at
that
least-
month before.
At least
and
6 months in
traveled
advance, if
to
not
all.
longer.
Say that again?
At least 6 months in advance, if not longer, if you're working on a show if possible.
You should
And
start.
I'll actually give you this example of Brava, which did this amazing Micronesian show last year called Tiara, produced by Tiara Productions in Los Angeles, called Masters of the Currents. And it was just a lovely, lovely show performed and co-created and devised with members of the Micronesian community. Many of whom left their islands and moved to Hawaii to find that there's a lot of racism towards the Micronesians in Hawaii, right? So they created this beautiful show. They work in Los Angeles. They came to Brava, and they asked me to do the community engagement for that show, and I was really happy to do it because of my connection to Hawaii, Pacific Island theater, Pacific Island cultures, having traveled, etc., etc. So so it wasn't like, oh yeah, just do it. It was like, oh well, I feel a connection and relationship is really important to this community. And so I kind of jumped on board, and it was fantastic the amount of outreach they did with Samoan Community Development Center, with this amazing program at City College called BASA, which is Oceanic Studies, and I mean, at all over the place, I met the most incredible people, and I felt reconnected to that part of the world that I love so much. So it kind of nourished me in that sense. I was very happy to do it. I feel like, again, reaching that community brought audiences to the theater that spoke many languages and filled that big Brava theater, which has 350 seats, a hard theater to fill. But really, it's very slow and hard work.
And what you're listing and what you talked about are processes that were started from the beginning. So you had the playwright saying, oh, these are things we need to have
It's
happen.
part of the grant.
Yes, it's part of the entire project. Like, I think it's really useful for us to say we need community engagement, but I actually think we need to do community engagement in a way that is different than most institutions label it. They usually label it as something that happens on the tail end in the last 2 weeks of the process, and it's just to get, oh, right, yeah, let's get the extra folks in here, let's get a couple kids, let's get a couple brown kids so we can have some good pictures and feel better about the optics of what we're doing, not recognizing it's actually a fundamental artistic necessity for it to not only have financial success, but also artistic success.
I'm going to get a bit academic, because if I don't, I'm going to start crying. Ayanna Thompson had an article maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15, I'm too old, I forget, about multiculturalism and colorblind casting. And it's a long essay. I recommend everybody to read it, because she exactly speaks about this issue. And in short, as I as an Eastern European can assess it, it says it takes a village. And she recommends that theaters who want to, who by any means necessary should do this important work, have to start from zero, invite something that would be a community think tank to serve as a liaison, dramaturg, however you call it, a year before the play is staged. Then engage the audience in conversation, engage the community in conversation at that time, not 6 months into before the show or in the 6th week before the opening. So it's a year earlier, start talking, even if it is a play that has been produced all the time. As long as it represents community, that's not your white dude stronghold. Engage these people in conversation and trust them unconditionally. From that point on, from a year ahead, you have nothing to do with it. It's the community that takes over with the director, and then it goes on. It doesn't, and then the show, opens, it closes, and then we are done. No, it has to be continued. And that's how you bring minority voices in the theater. I said, if I don't get academic, I'm going to start crying. I don't see that anybody's going to fund that. And it's a great essay. That's how it should be, but, can we all work for free in theater to make it better? I don't think so.
What's her name?
Ayanna Thompson.
I'd like to turn the conversation over to talk a little bit about House of Joy,
simply because it's about to open at Cal Shakes.
Yeah.
And I think that Eric Ting has brought, I think Cal Shakes has been working on this for quite a number of years on the issue of EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion at the theater. They started almost 10 years ago, I want to say. And so slowly and slowly, the theater has really transformed. So this process with a play called House of Joy, which we developed on last year's Bay Area Playwrights Festival by Madhuri Shekhar.
This is an interesting example of a play that doesn't really fit into one community. So I think it's fascinating because it's a play that its historical inspiration comes from 17th century Mughal India, specifically the female bodyguards who guarded the harems and who did not observe the veil and who carried bows and arrows, or they were trained in combat. And so historically there have been female bodyguards in different eras in India. There's lots of evidence and mention of them. There's not enough actually written about them, but so Madhuri takes their story and this inspiration of 17th century Mughal India, specifically she says someplace like Delhi, sometime like 1666, in some like the imperial harem of an unnamed emperor. and then she sort of knits this very contemporary sensibility with this historical inspiration. And the play has a very diverse cast, so it really breaks all rules, because it's not like, firstly, it's not really a South Asian play. It's not like a Mughal harem South Asian play. It just is a time in India where the harems had people from all across the Silk Road, and specifically, there were slaves that were brought from the Silk Road and
to work in the harem.
Yeah, yeah. So there were
And all women.
yeah, and of course there were boys who were castrated and worked as hijiras who rose to very high positions in the Mughal court as well, and the harem, and so you have people from so I mean this is really a beautiful play because you know it can't be cast with just South Asian actors. It needs people who are African descent. It needs people who are Central Asian, Middle Eastern. Asian, and we have a really diverse cast, and what's been fascinating is that we have a cast member who's of Japanese descent, and she said, well, what about Japan, and you know, the Silk Road, and I was like, I started researching it, I was like, oh, Japan, I'm not so sure, and but then I actually learned that the Portuguese brought Japanese slaves via trade, and brought them to Goa on the west coast of India, which is a colony of Portugal. And from Goa, they would make their way to the court. So we were like, yay, woo! we have this historical justification for why we were doing that. And then it went further, because then another actor said, well, I'm Filipina, and can I speak with a Filipina inflection? And then there's all this, the Hindu kings, from the south, much earlier than the Mughals. I mean, they had this influence all of Southeast Asia, and I was like, I don't know if it extended to the Philippines. And then I really started looking into that.
Good for you.
Yeah. But then it turns out there was some exchange with the Philippines. So it's amazing. The cast has found themselves that historically we might have been connected, and we are connected more than we think. And so it's not colorblind casting. It's meant to be a diverse harem, and I think for people like me who are, you know, I'm Indian, I love the Mughal era, I love courtesans, I love harems, I love eunuchs.
Don't edit that way.
I mean, now it's actually, it's not the right word anymore. So, you know, usually
It's okay.
hijra is the better term actually, but so you know, even I've had to pull back and go, you know what? This is a wild play. It's a reimagining that's using these historical elements. So, like, I've had to like check myself and go like, just chill out, you know, like. But it's also at the same time as a dramaturg offer that, be a cultural resource for that time and speak about the female bodyguards and the harems and actually how cosmopolitan the harems were. That's pretty wild. There's a lot of evidence of that. So,
Just to reflect on the story that you told prior, it sounds like you feel really comfortable in this setting,
I do.
in this theater company,
Yeah.
and in this project, and that you're.
I have a Maya director.
Right.
Maya director.
You have a Maya director.
Yeah, Megan, and then Madhuri, who's you know, very cool and very brilliant and very knowledgeable. And so I feel like with me being part of it, and at the same time understanding sort of the complexity of this marriage of 17th century with 19th sensibility, as the director likes to say, you know, and so we're really creating our own vocabulary.
And it sounds like
Yeah.
the company is an empowered
Yes,
team,
yes.
the artistic team,
Yeah,
to follow their vision,
yeah.
which I think
Yeah,
is
and
exciting.
And we have such an incredible, diverse cast, and not like, oh yeah, let's just have a cast that's diverse. You know, so
Right.
it's pretty fun, I think.
Right.
So.
I think, unfortunately, we have to end before you have a chance to talk, but we're around. If you'd like to, you know, we need to exit from the theater so the next team can come in and get ready. But we'll be in the lobby, and if you'd like to talk to any of our wonderful panelists, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.